All right, it's 20 minutes before 8 o'clock here on Morning Live. Thank you so much for staying with us. Now, land rights and ownership continues to be a complex topic of debate for South Africa. To try and understand the issues around land rights and distribution of land here at home, the book A Rights to Land, A Guide to Tenure, Upgrading and Restitution in South Africa has been released, and the book provides an analysis of what went so wrong and also warns that a new phase of restitution may ignite conflicting ethnic claims and also facilitate some capture of land and rural resources. But to talk to us more about this book, I'm joined in studio by Peter Delius. In fact, he's Professor Peter Delius. He's a co-author of the book Rights to Land, A Guide to Tenure, Upgrading and Restitution in South Africa. Prof, good morning to you and thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with what is contained in this book. Well, I got to read it and it talks to a lot of research that you might have conducted many years ago.
Yes, indeed. And this grows out of, between myself and my colleagues, I think there's probably about 160 years accumulated research went into this book. But it has grown out of a lifetime's research around land issues. But it's also a response to the critical issues today. And what we've tried to do is, given that land is such a significant and important issue, we've tried to draw on our own experience, both of contemporary issues and historical issues, to try and make a set of suggestions about what the key problems are and how one could set about resolving them.
Yeah, and my understanding really of this book when I read it, it talks about the current position and also sort of suggests how land rights may be cemented in order to ensure security.
Yes. Well, I think one of the things that we tend to talk less about, which is a profound consequence of apartheid, is not only was land unequally divided between black and white in South Africa, but in fact profoundly different legal systems came into being. So that whereas in white areas people were given private property in land, very strong, very secure forms of tenure in land. In the reserve areas and the Bantustans, African communities were given very much less secure rights in land. And in fact, over the 20th century, those rights in land diminished. So we have this unequal system, if you like, between strong rights for whites and those living in white areas, and weak rights for black South Africans. And one of the things that the Constitution enjoins us to do is to, in fact, strengthen those rights which have been weakened as a result of racism and apartheid. But in fact, so many years later, that injunction by the Constitution is yet to be met. We haven't strengthened yet effectively the rights of millions of South Africans living in rural areas.
But what is lacking, because the Constitution is providing for such?
Well, the Constitution provides that it should happen, but it doesn't actually specify how it should happen. So the critical issue is, how do we take those areas of South Africa, those systems of land rights which have been weakened, and how do we strengthen them, and how do we make them the equivalent of private property in land? And that is a complicated business, but it's also been one that hasn't been pursued with the intensity and interest. I think it's not one of the sort of sexier dimensions of land reform, and yet it's amongst the most fundamental. And it's something we really, really, after all these years, need to get round to.
Very complex indeed. Let's just focus a little bit on land restitution, as we know that it was initiated back in 1994 as a response to the injustices that were caused by the apartheid government. And we know that affected communities and families really, Prof, were hoping that the process would be speedily resolved or speedily completed. 23 years later, the process of land reform has still not been finalized. You've been researching this issue. What went wrong?
You know, it is shocking when you think about it. And it's even worse when you think that many of the old people, already old people who came forward with their land claims, lodged them by 1998. Many of them have died and never seen any return on their claims or real recognition of the losses that they've suffered. Part of what it is that land restitution was originally managed to be quite a simple, quick exercise. It was really going to be fixing the black spot removals, the most grotesque of the removals under the apartheid era. And the system wasn't set up to deal with a long-term, large-scale operation. What happened over time is, in fact, it completely outgrew the original expectations. And the institutions that were set up simply weren't resourced to deal with it. They took various shortcuts along the road to try and fix it, and as so often happens when you take a shortcut, you actually end up in a ditch. So things actually got worse. So what we have now is thousands and thousands of unresolved claims, which could take decades still to settle.
And really, in this book, Prof, you argue that land ownership and administration is very much important to rural democracy, and that it should not be placed under control of your traditionalist intermediaries, for example. What role do you think traditional leaders should perhaps play in the redistribution of land?
I think when you go back in history and you look at the 19th century prior to colonial conquest, what we can see is that ordinary families, households, had very, very strong rights to land. Effectively, they had rights to land which were the equivalent of property in land. What has happened over time is that those family rights to land have been weakened. And initially white officials, and then later on and in the present, chiefs have, or traditional leaders have, assumed a greater degree of authority and control over land. Now, my view would be that while traditional leaders have very many important roles to play in the society, they should not play a core role in either the ownership or distribution of land, because I think what that does is to take away rights from ordinary citizens, ordinary people, and make political authorities responsible.
And I think that is what many rural dwellers believe, that they sort of losing out on their rights to land because of exactly what we're talking about. So do you think the current legislation is sort of empowering traditional leaders instead of your rural dwellers?
Yes, I mean, I think at the moment there's a good deal of confusion around the legislation. There is legislation before Parliament at the moment, which is also far from clear about what it wants to do. You know, on one hand, it wants to empower ordinary people. On the other hand, it wants to give effective control to chiefs. So what we need is a radical overhaul of the legislation that we've got to ensure that the rights of families and ordinary people are strengthened, and we need to move that legislation through Parliament, move ahead with that legislation after all of these years.
Yeah, and we know that in 2016 a high-level panel was also appointed by Parliament, headed by former President Kgalema Motlanthe, to also focus on this issue of land around the country. The report was released, and part of the recommendations really, Prof, was that the Ingonyama Trust that's headed by the Zulu King Goodwill Nzolithini should be dissolved, and that the law that established it on the eve of South Africa's liberation in 1994 should also be repealed. Will this be difficult to implement?
Look, I think it is very difficult. I mean, these are very important rights, and they can be a very significant source of wealth to people. I mean, land and wealth and power are all tied together. As we know, people don't like to give up power and wealth. But I do think if we look at our history, if we look at the Constitution, if we look at customary law, it is very clear that it is inappropriate for a trust of that kind to be taking ownership of people's land. That it's in fact undermining the rights of ordinary people to control and own and prosper on their own pieces of land.
Yeah, and we hear many political parties calling for land to be given back to their rightful owners. Let's get your quick view on some of the resolutions taken by the ANC at their 54th National Conference to say that land should be expropriated without compensation.
Look, I think the problem about that is that it actually misdiagnoses what the fundamental problems are. In all the research that we've done on these issues, we don't find that being able to expropriate is the issue. In fact, under existing law, under the existing constitution, we have many mechanisms which enable us to expropriate. We also have ways of ensuring that people don't get paid inflated prices. What has happened is we haven't used the existing legislation properly. And in fact, opportunities to test the levels of compensation that should be paid have been missed. But in fact, there are dozens of other reasons in the system, political, economic, bureaucratic, which explain why restitution reform is taking so long. Expropriation without compensation comes very low on the list.
All right, Prof, I'm afraid we have to leave it at that, but thank you so much for coming through. There's so much to get through. Is the book available already?
It's available at exclusive bookshops via Amazon and Jacana Press.
All right, Professor Peter Delius, a co-author of the book Rights to Land, A Guide to Tenure, Upgrading and Restitution in South Africa, talking to us about the state of affairs in terms of our land here in South Africa. Let's take a quick ad break. There's still so much more to come. We continue talking about land.